Hello, everyone. This lecture is going to cover Art Now, a Global Perspective, and it corresponds with Chapter 22 in Understanding Art, 11th edition. The learning objectives for this lecture include being able to define and explain contemporary art themes resulting from globalization, including hybridity, appropriation, and postcolonialism. Discussing representative works of art from around the world as examples of contemporary art themes, and compare and contrast artistic examples from different regions in terms of common qualities and specific cultural contexts. Holland Cotter wrote this quote that starts the chapter. A few decades back, when the art world was smaller and easier to police and international meant Manhattan and Western Europe, New York more or less dictated what kind of art would be looked at, what ideas would circulate, what would be cool. But this is no longer so. The arena has expanded. Although economically powerful, New York is increasingly just one of many art centers doing their local thing. Most work that turns up in Manhattan galleries has little connection with or pertinence to what artists are doing and thinking about in Africa or India or even the Bronx. So, for this lecture, we're going to be looking at contemporary artists who are alive and working today. And we're no longer really discussing specific styles that large groups of artists are subscribing to or dedicated to. We're more looking at themes that artists kind of fall under in terms of what their work is about. The phenomenon of globalization has created a world in which cultures are no longer distant from each other and people and places are no longer separate. Art historians and critics have had to find new ways of analyzing and organizing materials on the subject of multiculturalism and cross culturalism in contemporary art. Concepts such as hybridity, appropriation, and post colonialism are important for understanding the art of the 21st century. So we'll start with talking about hybridity. Hybridity is the mixing of traditions of different cultures to create new blends and new connections. High art and high culture, often associated with classical antiquity and perpetuated through the artistic traditions of the Renaissance, have traditionally been contrasted with low culture or popular/mass culture. Some contemporary art focuses on the blurring of boundaries between high art and low culture. A good example of this concept of hybridity is with Takashi Murakami, and he is kind of considered to be Japan's version of Andy Warhol. And just like Andy Warhol did, Murakami questions the separation of high art and low culture and draws on consumer culture for his imagery. He's very self promotional, so he exhibits his work in major museums around the world, as well as creating like mass market products from like t shirts to keychains, stuff like that. When he was younger, he was really interested in the possibility of illustrating Japanese graphic novels, which are called manga, and they have, a pretty long history in Japan, just in terms of like illustrating stories, just like a lot of places do. But the Japanese manga was heavily influenced by American comic books when Japan was essentially occupied by the United States after World War II. A lot of American culture came over to Japan from that time period. When Murakami was younger, he experimented with this popular anime style, which is the animation style that developed in Japan with very large eyes, figures with really gigantic eyes. So he has been trained in classical Japanese painting techniques. So his work is very much this combination of high art and low culture. And so he has a lot of cartoon like imagery, a lot of simple dark outlines, just kind of fill in with these bright colors. The image that we're looking at is somewhat maybe a little bit reminiscent of Mickey Mouse. This is the artist's signature character, Mr. D.O.B. Dob. And it's kind of his alter ego. And so this particular image that we have is very kind of pop art with the bright colors and just very uh, what you see is what you see, like this kind of cartoony style. And so he is an artist who continually is making not a lot of distinction between his art and merchandise and just popular imagery. Okay, now we're going to look at the concept of appropriation. Appropriation became part of the lexicon of contemporary art with the advent of postmodernism in the 1980s. But the concept stretches back to early 20th century movements such as Cubism and Dada. So, appropriation consists of borrowed elements. And sometimes the new work builds on or changes the one that is appropriated, but not all. But in other times, the original image is unaltered. So I'm just bringing in a couple of Marcel Duchamp's works because that was mentioned with Cubism and Dada, the idea of just borrowing elements. Marcel Duchamp was famous for the idea of just finding a pre-existing object and declaring that it's art. And they were called ready-mades. And so he essentially put a bicycle wheel on top of a stool and said, like, here it is. The image on the right is his famous urinal that he literally, put a pre-existing prefabricated urinal. He signed it a different name. He didn't even sign it his actual name, and he entered it into a show. So this idea of borrowing an element from real life or from whatever and changing the meaning of it and bringing it in a new way, right? Changing the original meaning. This urinal is clearly not meant for the original purpose. It's now an art object, right? So that's what essentially appropriation is. I'm bringing in an image of work by Betty Saar that I think is a good example as well of appropriation. And this is called The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, and it is an assemblage sculpture. So if you're not familiar with Aunt Jemima, she was a character essentially created by a pancake company to market products. And it's based on the stereotype of the black mammy, the essentially the housemaid during slavery times who would have been the housekeeper or the cook. Many times these women helped raise the white children that lived in the home. And so throughout our history, we have not only the proliferation of these images on products, pancake mix, things like that, but also just household objects like little figurines that maybe, like held a notepad or salt and pepper shakers and things like that. And it perpetuated these stereotypes throughout culture and throughout history. And so what Betty Saar has done has been to take these images and try to change them in a way. So she's borrowing these elements from marketing, from these products and changing the meaning of them. So I think this is a good example of how appropriation can sometimes be done in a way to change the original meaning. So in this case, the image of Aunt Jemima is placed here in several different ways in the background. She also has this little figurine. She also has like another image of her in the front holding a child. But then Betty Saar has also brought in some other components. She's brought in a couple of firearms, and she has the black power fist in the front. And the idea is that Aunt Jemima is being liberated from this concept of just being a stereotype. She's, regaining control over her image and her identity. And actually, since probably in the past decade, the company that did create the image of Aunt Jemima has rebranded and has changed that name in order to let go of the perpetuation of that stereotype of the black mammy. Okay, the textbook image that discusses appropriation is has a work by the artist Vic Muniz, and I'll show you the work from the textbook, but I find the series that he did, Pictures of Garbage, to be a lot more powerful and interesting. So Vic Muniz is a Brazilian artist, and he is known for using a lot of non-traditional art materials for photography. So he's done a whole series where he's done recreations of like masterworks like the Mona Lisa, but he did it with chocolate syrup. The images that we are looking at are from his series of the Pictures of Garbage, where he went to the uh, largest dump in Brazil and Rio de Janeiro. I can't remember the exact place, but anyway, he went to this dump, and there are people that work at the dump that they go through and they find recyclable materials, because this area in Brazil did not have like a city sponsored recycling program. So there were companies that will pay people to find materials that they can recycle, and so there are people who literally, that's what their job is every day, is they go out to this huge dump and like go through the trash to find things that they can be recycled. And so Vic wanted to do this work, these large photographs using actual trash. So he hired the some of the workers to help him with the project. He did not take any money from this project. The money specifically that was raised from selling of the photographs and things like that went back to the people. And so this is, you can see he is not only appropriating objects, he is borrowing image objects, literally trash from the dump, but he's also borrowing imagery. This is kind of a remix of The Death of Marat, which was a Jacques Louis David painting. And he's redone it, but it's all arranged with trash. So let me show you how this is done. So this is like a really large room, and you can see the floor has been painted white, and he's arranging the trash in a way that it's portraits of the garbage pickers. So he photographed the people that he was helping, that he hired to do this, and then he's doing images of them with the trash. So it's kind of very multi-layered. And so when they needed shadowing and things like that, they would just kind of use the dirt that they had, gotten from a lot of the objects and things like this. So then he would go up on like this balcony and take a picture. And the pictures are what were sold and what were exhibited. And then there's actually a great documentary about this whole thing. And I've posted the trailer, link to the trailer on it, on our Blackboard site. It's called Wasteland, and it's a really powerful thing about how art can really make a difference. Okay, this is the image that the textbook includes. Vic also did a whole series using actual diamonds. This is an image of Elizabeth Taylor. So in this case, he is doing this series called The Diamond Divas, and he's using completely different art material besides garbage, and he's using something really expensive. So he literally was able to somehow get a hold of 500 carats of diamonds and arrange them in the likenesses. And so he did a whole series with like Sophia Loren and Brigitte Bardot and Elizabeth Taylor. And so this image is also playing on the idea, remember with Andy Warhol, how he did pop art portraits of very famous people. So it's a little bit, kind of borrowing that idea as well. Okay, now we're going to look at the concept of post-colonialism. Some aspects of globalization in the art are a reaction to the retreat of the European empires that ruled much of the world through the middle of the 20th century. The former colonies in the Americas, Africa, and the Middle East, and Far Eastern Asia bear complex relationships with their former rulers, political, economic, ethnic, and cultural. Art that emphasizes these complexities deals with post-colonial themes. Hugh Locke is a London-based artist who was raised in Guyana, which is on the coast of South America. And the Guyana was once part of the British Empire. And so this sculpture that he made was entered in essentially kind of as a proposal for a place in London and a London square. So there are four pedestals designed for heroic sculpture, and the fourth one was left unfinished. And so today it serves as a site for temporary art projects. So this particular sculpture, Skandar, was proposed to be there for a while. And so this sculpture, you can see kind of the equestrian sculpture that we have seen since ancient times. This particular one references Alexander the Great, but the overall form also is pulled from another equestrian monument somewhere else in London. It honors another British field marshal. So the artist is borrowing the original forms from these other artists and from these other monuments, but he is kind of drawing attention to kind of the weightiness of some of those kind of like heroes that one culture maybe honors as a hero, where other cultures, based on their experience of the being occupied country or the colonized country, maybe views them a little bit differently. So this particular sculpture is kind of weighed down by the kind of quote unquote plundered loot, all these plastic trinkets and medals and sabers and charms and little votive offerings. And so the hero is essentially kind of chained to his horse. He's in this dignified posture, but he's somewhat like immobilized, like he cannot move because of all the stuff that's all over him. So all these symbols of conquest and colonialism. So now we're going to go through and look at some other art from around the world and some artists who are kind of working from this place of being in a post-colonial world. So we're going to start with India and Pakistan. So mid-20th century, India becomes an independent nation from the British rule under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. He embraced civil disobedience rather than violence, and Martin Luther King Jr. would actually adopt a lot of his pacifist models for the civil rights movement in the United States. Gandhi had encouraged the boycott of British goods and tried to promote friendship between Hindus and Muslims, although we do know that eventually there was an establishment of the country of Pakistan that was designed to be a home for Muslims. Okay, so we're looking at contemporary Indian artist Subodh Gupta, and he grew up in a very poor area of India. Today he lives in New Delhi, which is a city known for having pretty extreme economic situations, like very rich people and also very, very poor people. And so a lot of his work taps into kind of sacred and ancient symbols from India, as well as a lot of found objects that he works with. So the uh, work that we're looking at here is called Silk Route, and it emphasizes India's key historic and contemporary role in globalization, right? The Silk Road was an extremely important trade route that ran about 4,000 miles through India. It connected China to the Mediterranean. And so there were caravans of merchants that were going over this Silk Road, trading things from cotton to linen, pearls, ivory, spices, perfumes, more other kinds of materials like copper, tin, wool, wine. And so this work is a lot of polished silvery bowls and utensils. And the idea is to talk a little bit about that tradition of trade on the Silk Road, but also just about the fact that all of these objects are piled on top of each other in this really crowded space. It's also talking about contemporary overcrowding of the cities in India, and possibly some kind of the social disconnect between poverty in the inner cities and some of the architecture that's springing up in terms of these huge buildings that can only be paid for by like very wealthy companies and things like that. So it's kind of not only bringing us back to the past, but also drawing attention to some of the things that are happening in the contemporary world today too. Shazia Stikandar is an artist who was born in Pakistan, and she studied at the Rhode Island School of Design called RISD, and she now lives and works in the United States. So she has made this work of art that reminds us of the miniature paintings that we've seen from India before, that kind of Asian or Persian miniature painting that's very traditional. And she is trying to cast some light on past and present challenges faced by both women and gays in the Islamic world. So she has done this small little profile portrait, and it's possibly the 17th century Mughal emperor who was supposedly, or I guess had the reputation for being gay, but yet enforced Islamic restrictions against and had punishments for gay Muslims. And so she's also included a Hindu goddess and some Hindu nymphs around that portrait. So she is just drawing attention to that contrast of the fact that there is some, and like traditional Hindu art, and there is some kind of embracing of sexuality, but also there is some oppressive strictures against that in the Muslim world. Now we're going to move to China, and virtually all the art that was made under the communist rule that when Mao was in power was very much all about exalting the Communist Party and promoting virtues of hard work and service for the greater good. But now in our contemporary world, there are a lot of Chinese artists who have some more freedom for expression and who are no longer making art that is necessarily just pro-government. And there are Chinese artists who travel around and are represented all over the world and have some freedom of expression and some freedom to travel freely and promote their work. So this is a work by Wang Gongxin, which is one of the kind of early video artists in China. His works have largely focused on the anxiety experienced by ordinary Chinese people as their lives have been transformed by rapid industrialization. So, the idea with like growing pollution and just changes in traditional values. So, recently, China has experienced a lot of economic boom, and so cities have been growing pretty quickly. There's been some flux in their just their economy in general. So the video that we are looking at, Our Sky is Falling In, it portrays just an everyday family, and they're suddenly disrupted when the ceiling begins to collapse. So the video is very much kind of a personal story, but also a comment on the helplessness of the individual amid the forces of progress and modernization. And this is a lithograph by Zhang Xiaogang, and it's called Big Family. And it has some kind of references to communist China with the red figure, as well as the just one child with the two parents. It kind of draws a reminder to the Chinese kind of one child rule that they had for a really long time. So you see the clothing of the two parents is kind of drab, and the whole painting is kind of in a pretty monotone color palette, with the exception of the red on the child. And there's a very kind of blank look on everyone's faces. Excuse me. And the title of this is called Big Family, which once again is kind of a like ironic with the the one child policy, and it does bring to mind the idea that because females were not considered to be as important as males in the Chinese culture, there were a lot of abortions when women found out that they were going to have a daughter, because being a male in Chinese society was better. So people having boys was more important for a long time. That is changing somewhat today, because now there's a disproportionate number of males to females, and so now they're actually trying to figure out how to balance that back out. Okay, this is called Welcome to the World Famous Brand by the Liu Brothers, and it emphasizes kind of the meeting of consumerism and globalism. So it continues this theme of East meets West, or in this case, kind of how the West invades the East with Big Macs. And so there is somewhat of a play with some packaging imagery from Chinese merchandise, and so a lot of their compositions, excuse me, are often overcrowded. They have a lot of intense colors, and they're exuberant. There's a lot of energy, and there's not really anything a whole lot to stop and focus on. Certainly, there is kind of a focal point with the little baby in the middle, kind of holding up the Big Mac. And so there's a lot of things going on. It seems very boisterous, but you've got just stacks and stacks of burgers, and you've got some brightly colored flowers add to this kind of festive atmosphere. The idea behind it is that it almost kind of brings up kind of religious altarpieces throughout art history, just like that kind of central figure, often with like maybe being surrounded by like angels and things like that. But this is kind of the Liu brothers showing us kind of like what we worship in contemporary society. I did want to bring up the fact that there are some artists in China who have gotten a little bit too loud with their protests against the Communist Party, and they have wound up with some restrictions and lost privileges. Probably the best example of this is Ai Weiwei, who is a Chinese artist who worked in China for a very long time, and often had some negative things to say about the Chinese Communist government. He got in trouble. He lived under house arrest for a long time. His work has been exhibited throughout the world as well. He now lives in a different country. I'm trying to remember, it's Peru or Portugal or somewhere like that, but he has since left China. And his work is extremely varied, which I think is important to recognize about a lot of contemporary artists, is that we're no longer looking at artists who necessarily stick to exactly one medium. Certainly there are lots of artists who do, but Ai Weiwei is a good example of an artist who works in a variety of mediums. He does a lot of sculpture, he does installation. So it's a lot of artists nowadays are kind of more in that conceptual realm about it starts with the idea, and then the materials kind of follow that in terms of whatever the artist envisions. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, Ai Weiwei did this entire series. The image on the right is he hired artisans from a province in China that is known as the porcelain capital of the world. He hired people to make these tiny porcelain sunflower seeds, and they're all handmade, hand painted, and then he would install the exhibits. For example, this one is in the Tate Gallery in London, and people could walk around and touch them. And the idea of like they're all the same, but they're all individual. That was a really fascinating exhibit. It's just called Sunflower Seeds. Okay, and the textbook talks a little bit about architecture in China. Chinese cities have become boom towns for contemporary architecture. Um, for the time being, there's a lot of growth in China, and the idea that there's a lot of opportunity. So there are some architects that are building new and unusual pieces of architecture that you would maybe not see in a lot of other places. There was a lot of buildup during the time for the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics. And there's a quote in the textbook that talks about a Beijing-based architect that said, architecture in China has become like a kung fu film with all of these giants trying to vanquish one another. So it's kind of like who can build the next biggest, most, like extravagant thing. Now we're going to move over to Japan. During the later part of the 20th century, the Japanese artists in Japan maintained the strong traditions of printmaking and painting and ceramics. And it's film that they really entered into global pop culture. And as you can see here, our example is the movie Godzilla, which I'm just going to say I really love that in this textbook we have talked about artists such as Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Georgia O'Keeffe. And now we're talking about Godzilla. So this was directed by Ishiro Honda, and it really captured the interest of viewers all around the world, even outside of Japan, even though it did have some primitive special effects, although at the time in the 1950s, they weren't that primitive. It has had nearly 30 sequels. My son is trying to watch every single one of them, and has, of course, lots of merchandise associated with it in terms of comic book art, toys, video games, things like that. For those of you not familiar, the story of Godzilla tells the story of a 400-foot prehistoric monster who is awakened from the depths of the Pacific when the Japanese are doing some hydrogen bomb tests. And he is angry. He's provoked by the depth charges, and then he uses his fiery breath to destroy Tokyo. And eventually he is killed by another weapon of mass destruction that destroys the oxygen in the water around him. So this is somewhat about the Japanese fears about weapons of mass destruction after World War II and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And even though the humans need to be saved from Godzilla, Godzilla is also somewhat of a victim because of the nuclear testing that the humans are doing. So this was certainly on the minds of the Japanese, as I mentioned, because of the bombing of the two cities in Japan during World War II. And one could probably say that the film of Godzilla is somewhat of a protest film against that. Now we're going to look at the work of Akira Yamaguchi, and a lot of his subject matter comes from historic sources, so mixing of past and present, West and non-West, things like that. So the one that we are looking at here today is called Votive Tablet of a Horse, and it looks like a wooden plaque with the image of a sacred white horse. A lot of times these are traditional images that serve as religious offerings in Japanese shrines and temples, and the symbol of the horse is believed to have pure, like it's a symbol of purity, divine messages, and it's the symbol of immortality for poets. And the artist here has replaced the legs on the horse with this kind of fantastic combination of motorcycle parts and robotics. So this is a really good example of kind of old meets new, tradition meeting modernity. And the last artist that we're going to look at is Mariko Mori, last artist for Japan. And she's a good example of how contemporary artists don't just stick with one medium, but really, when they have the concept of their work, they kind of work with what fits the idea. She is a photographer and a video artist. She was a model at one point and a fashion design student. So she has created some computer manipulated self portraits where she kind of makes herself look futuristic and kind of like cyberish, and so she does some work like that. The work that we're looking at is called Wave UFO, and this is kind of a sculpture, installation, architecture, video piece, and people are participants in it instead of viewers, because when they enter the space, the imagery that appears on the screen within that capsule is determined by connecting a participant's brain waves to an interactive biofeedback loop. So it's very much connected to the participant and the artist. And she has been working with references to Japanese religion and culture in her recent work. So this particular one has some connections to the Buddhist vision of nirvana. And the quote in the textbook that talks about this work, it says that she has said that the experience of the piece reveals that human beings as collective living beings shall unify and transcend cultural differences and national borders through positive and creative evolution. Let's hope so. Now we're going to take a look at a Korean artist. Do Hosu is a contemporary artist who splits his time between the United States and England and Korea. And he's a really good example of how contemporary artists in the 21st century are very international in some ways. And he does work from California all the way to Scandinavia. So he's kind of all over the place. He originally earned a degree in Oriental painting, so traditional brush painting in Korea. And then he also went to RISD, which is the Rhode Island School of Design, and Yale. And so he's very international. And the work that we are looking at is this sculpture installation that is some pieces of architecture that are kind of scaled down to 1/5 their original size. So this was at the Contemporary Museum in Los Angeles. Yes, Los Angeles County Museum. And it is a replica of the house in Korea that he grew up in that is smashing down onto the Rhode Island apartment that he lived in when he was at RISD. And so everything that's in there is scaled down, like I mentioned. And so it's very much accessible as the viewer, kind of as a somewhat of kind of like a voyeur. We can see everything. And so it might bring up, kind of thoughts about like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like the house smashing down from Kansas. And so this is somewhat autobiographical in the terms that it references places that he's lived, but he's also talking about culture shock. And there is a parachute that's kind of draped on everything. So the idea wasn't that it just like smashed down abruptly, that it kind of had this like soft landing. And the quote talks about that the artist was talking about how the culture shock for him going from Korea to the United States wasn't something that like happened very quickly. It took a long time. So imagine like the house kind of floating down with the parachute. That's kind of how he's symbolizing his culture shock of Korea meeting the United States. Now we're going to shift to the Middle East, and many contemporary artists from this region A lot of their work often reflects some of the tensions between secular and the religious, and a lot of those tensions are also connected to politics. So, this is the work of Mona Hatoum, and she's born into a Palestinian family in Lebanon and went to school in London and has lived and worked in Europe ever since. So, a lot of her early stuff was video and performance, but more recently, she's been focusing on sculpture or site specific installations. And a lot of her work deals with violence and oppression, geopolitical tensions, which are some common themes in the Middle East. The work that we're looking at is called Shift, and it's inspired by and produced in Istanbul. And so it has this connection to Turkish traditions of carpet weaving because it is a large piece of wool on the floor. It's over 8 feet long and 5 feet wide. And so we have a map of the world that's divided into these slightly shifting segments. And the map has these concentric circles over top of it that are representing seismic activity. So the title really talks about the shift, right? The idea that the entire world is suffering reverberations or aftershocks of the explosive situations in any one place. Really maybe talking about the fact that, we all are affected by things that happen in certain places, whether we're necessarily aware of it or not. And that, as a world culture, we need to, be more aware of that we're all in this together. This is a film still, which just means a picture from a film by the artist Shirin Neshat. And we looked at her at the very beginning of the semester when we were talking about different mediums. She was one of the examples of film as an art form. She's a native Iranian artist who has lived for a long time outside of Iran. She went to school in California and has been living in exile for a long time. She has worked as a photographer and video artist and filmmaker most of her career, and her work is devoted to issues concerning gender roles in the post-revolutionary Islamic society. The one that we are looking at is called Passage, and she commissioned the composer Philip Glass to write the music for us. And so it follows the ritual of passage from like life to death. So men are carrying a shrouded body and women are preparing a grave with their hands, and a little girl sets a fire that is to circumscribe the scene. So during one of the film's most abstract and intensely visual passages, that you have Philip Glass's music, which if you're not familiar with him, he has non-traditional type of music style. But it has this very close up of the women singing, and there's oil bubbling kind of from the ground. And so there's a lot of natural elements, and it's a lot about life, death, and the concept of rebirth. Okay, before I talk about this photograph, I want you just to look at it for a moment and think back to all the artwork that we've been looking at this semester and see if this has the resemblance to any other previous works that you might have seen. Okay, if you're thinking that it looks a little bit like The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, you're right. This is the work by Israeli artist Adi Ness, and he's known for staging photographs of young male actors posing as Israeli soldiers. So part of his work is about his interests in looking at masculinity and male identity. He identifies as a gay man, and so he is particularly interested in looking at like issues of masculinity, physical strength, things like that. So this particular photograph is recreating Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And so he is substituting soldiers at a table in a mess hall instead of the apostles. And so he's drawing our attention to the location with the kind of basic wall and the basic table setup. And the idea that there's a connection there with so many of the events from the Bible that are said to have occurred, in Israel, and that this is making a connection with that. And in this case, the soldiers are kind of talking and laughing, unlike the Da Vinci Last Supper, where it's this kind of pretty much right after Jesus has said that one of his apostles is going to betray him, and they're all kind of shocking and talk about it. And this version, the soldiers are all kind of chatting and talking nicely, but there is a little vibe of maybe, like what's to come, the fact that they are soldiers and there is probably going to be some action, whatever, you do see that on the face of the central figure. In his role of artist and social critic, some of his work is intended to point out the discrepancy between the dream of Israel and certain social realities of contemporary Israel. This is the work by Akram Zaatari, and he is an artist from Lebanon but lives and works in Beirut. And this is a still from a film that he made, and this was inspired by a rumor about an Israeli pilot in 1982 who, rather than follow the orders to bomb Saida, which was the artist's hometown, he released his payload into the Mediterranean Sea. The rumor turned out to be true. The pilot concluded that the building that he was supposed to bomb must not be a military target because he had studied architecture and recognized the school as a structure that looked like a hospital or a school. And so this video is kind of retelling that story. And the image that we are looking at shows the pilot's change from his flight plan, as denoted by the paper airplane, and heading towards the sea. And the title of the video references an essay that was written by writer-philosopher Albert Camus during World War II. The pilot's challenge of military authority brought to Zaatari's mind Camus' statement, "I should be able to love my country and still love justice." And this is a work by the artist Emily Jassir. She was born to a Palestinian family and grew up in Saudi Arabia. And she currently lives in the West Bank and Rome. And she has used her work as a way to spotlight the hardships of the Palestinian people. So she has done some secret filming of just the prolonged delays that Palestinian workers have to go through as they try to pass through Israeli checkpoints. And she uses her own US passport to be able to kind of move among people a little bit more easily, and often will help facilitate communication among family members that have had have been disconnected due to space and just the situation with territories there. This work that she did is a tent stitched with the names of Palestinian villages that have been depopulated by Israel over long years of conflict between the two peoples. And it's similar to a tent in the refugee camps in Gaza. And this is the work by an Egyptian artist who has lived in Egypt for his whole life. He does a body of work that tackles issues of identity, artistic identity, national identity, religious identity, and how the effects of globalization have affected that. He does some little films. These are actually puppet animations, and they retell the history of the medieval Crusades from an Arabic perspective. So he uses little puppets, and some of them are traditional. They're very old puppets that he has employed to tell the use of. And it can the idea by using the puppets is about control. And the textbook quotes him talking about his work, and he says, "The work also implies a criticism of the way history has been written and manipulated." So the use of puppetry, and the fact that the artist has to manipulate the puppets is very much a purposeful choice. Now we're going to move over to Africa, and I apologize for in the last screen the artist that we talked about, the Egyptian artist Vail Shosky. He's an Egyptian artist, which is in Africa, but the textbook, I guess, still has him lumped as a Middle Eastern artist. I don't know. That's a little bit problematic. But Egypt is very much in Africa. And I wanted to bring in this artist, El Cid, who that's his artist name. And he is an artist who is French Tunisian, and Tunisia is also on the continent of Africa. And he does this really cool work with calligraphy and graffiti. And in Islamic art, being a calligrapher is considered a very high art form, to be able to write beautifully and to write Arabic. And El Cid does a lot of very large work where he uses Arabic calligraphy to decorate the exteriors of walls. And a lot of times, much like in graffiti, the calligraphy is, so abstracted or kind of overlapping each other or whatever, that's actually hard to read. And he has said in some videos that he doesn't think that it's super important that you be able to actually read what it says. It's kind of more about the idea and the aesthetic of it, which I think is something true to traditional like English graffiti as well. It's kind of more about the aesthetic and not so much about whether or not you can actually read it. And I wanted to just highlight the work Perception that's over on the left side. This was a project that he did in a part of Egypt where he went to a Christian Coptic neighborhood area. And these people that live in this area excuse me, are known, they are kind of their role in the culture is to be the trash collectors. And so the area that they live in is kind of looked down upon because of what these people do. They collect the trash. But he wanted to bring some beauty and some community to this space. So this was a project that took several years and lots of volunteers, but you can see that he painted the sides of all these buildings. And then when you line up right into the right spot, you can see the whole piece as a cohesive whole. And the Arabic that it says is a quote from a Coptic saint that says, anyone who wants to see the sunlight first must first wipe his own eye. So it's about not being judgmental towards these people and looking down upon them because of what they do for their jobs. His work is really amazing, and he has some really positive messages. I'll put a couple of his TED Talks. I'll post them in my little Blackboard folder that has kind of some of my favorite artist highlights and videos and stuff. This is the work by the artist Samuel Faso, and he began his career as a photographer by taking self-portraits and later changed into doing self-portraits that are impersonations that have a lot of socio-political messages. So for this particular work, it's called The Chief, He Who Sold Africa to the Colonists. And what he's referencing is the fact that there were African chieftains who sold their land and slaves to colonists. So this particular one, he is wearing the clothes and is in the pose of an African chieftain. He's kind of holding some objects and kind of wearing the decorative clothing and jewelry that kind of indicate his power and prestige. So he's wearing leopard skins and has all this gold jewelry, things that show him far beyond the means of just ordinary people. His scepter is a little bouquet of sunflowers, and it's suggesting the rulers seeking his place in history. And some of his other self-portraits, he's impersonated some other well-known figures like Nelson Mandela and Muhammad Ali, and even civil rights activist Angela Davis. And I just wanted to quickly show an older photographer, Seydou Keita, who's no longer alive, but he is you can see some connections between Samuel Fosso's work with the very patterned background and floor, is something that draws on a tradition of African portrait photography. Seydou Keita didn't do self-portraits. He was a kind of a community photographer and would do photographs of people who would consciously pick out their clothing and bring in objects that they wanted to pose with, much like we do in a lot of our portrait photography today. But I just wanted to show a connection there that Samuel Fosso's work is kind of going on a tradition of very consciously constructed portrait photography. And we're coming back to El Anatsui. I think we mentioned him at the beginning of the semester with some earlier work when we talked about mediums. But El Anatsui lives and works in Nigeria. He was born in Ghana, and kente cloth is a silk and cotton textile made of really colorful interwoven strips, originated in Ghana. And El Anatsui does these amazing wall hanging sculpture pieces that are all made from recycled aluminum wrappings of liquor bottles and bottle caps and other packaging. So it's a way to make use of essentially what people call trash and turn it into an absolutely beautiful textile-like wall hanging. So these pieces are very much in the same realm as what I would talk about with Mark Rothko's work, and that it has way more of a visual effect when you see them in person. If you ever have a chance to see an El Anatsui, they are just magical, and it takes everything I can not to just reach out and touch them. They are somewhat different every time they're hung on the wall, but he's very conscious of how the pieces are put together. Each one is very individually hooked together with little copper wire. Like all of these little pieces are just like have holes punched in them and are linked together with the copper wire. It's a very tedious process that he has like a team of people help him with, but they are just absolutely amazing. The way they shimmer and just kind of look like they have this movement to them, because they do technically have a lot of movement to them. This is the work by Romuald Hazume, and it's a good example of how contemporary African artists often work with traditional techniques or art forms and combine them with Western references. And this is connecting back to that concept of hybridity that really corresponds to the melding of cultures that occurred in Africa as a result of European and Arab colonization, and it continues to factor into African life today. This particular piece is, of course, making a reference to traditional African ceremonial masks. And this is from a series that he was trying to talk about the shortage and use of gasoline, because this is made from a gasoline container. It references the exploitation of African resources and essentially somewhat of an economic enslavement of Africans who are dealing with ferrying fuel. A lot of these sculptures kind of carry that tradition of the European ready-made, where you take an object like Duchamp did and kind of like appropriate it into the artwork. So he does a lot of that with these gasoline containers and changing it into a mask. He's drawing attention to the effects of global encounters on cultural traditions of masking. And this is a work by the artist Wangechi Mutu. She is Kenyan, and it's another example of hybridity. She really puts together contemporary magazine images and African traditional objects. And a lot of her work is politically charged or has feminist messages about women's bodies. And so in this particular work, she's got a cutout of a model, and she's kind of somewhat covered up, and it's kind of referencing maybe the sexualized stereotype of like of a woman with power, and so it's kind of overturning the traditional male female power relationship. A lot of her works illustrate twisted female anatomy and draws attention to kind of just like sexualization, as well as neglect of African women by oppressive men. And so she's making reference to, you know, the underlying suffering that can happen with women, and she wants to challenge people's assumptions about race, gender, and identity. So that piece by Wangechi Mutu was called Mask, and the previous image was also a mask work of art. So we're going to just take a moment and just touch on the enduring legacy of the ceremonial mask. So when we think about African art, a lot of times what comes to our mind is the carving of masks. These have religious and spiritual meanings. They're often the focal piece of the masquerade. And I've mentioned this before, the larger ceremonial dance and performance events that happen at funerals or initiation rites or social gatherings or even entertainment. And mask makers have a very special status in the society, as do the mask wearers. And often their craft of making the masks is passed down through family lines. So in the early 20th century, the mask really became kind of the quintessential object that people thought about with traditional African culture and art. And a lot of European artists collected them and appropriated some of their imagery. So we have the Pablo Picasso little kind of study for his some of his work, like Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, that we saw with Cubism. And he incorporated a lot of the shapes and facial features in his work and came back to that throughout his career. There's some other artists who have also incorporated masking kind of imagery as well. This is the artist Faith Ringgold and her piece, Mrs. Jones and Family. It's a mixed media sculpture with some fabric and embroidery. And you can see that the soft sculpture dolls have some of those common features of African masks, and as well as the kente cloth kind of fabric that they have on them. So those elements are connecting the artist both to her African heritage and artistic traditions like needlework and quilting among enslaved African women. And then on the right side, we've got a piece by Willie Cole. He has created mask-like sculptures from women's high-heeled shoes that reference some different African traditions as well as contemporary fashion. So this particular mask is called Shine, and it has both positive and negative associations. The use of the word shine is something that references African Americans working as like shoe polishing or shoe shining, and that was a way for young boys or men to earn a living. But also the same word, the idea of just the word shine connote, like it has that connotation of radiance and the idea of positivity, with also referencing the way that a mask might have had some powerful spiritual power, like kind of that power kind of shining out from it. And so Willie Cole wrote, like, I want the masks to be links between worlds, art that looks like it is from another culture and another time, even though the materials in the work are strictly American. And the last artist I wanted to bring in was the artist Nick Cave, because he doesn't necessarily build masks, but he um, creates these pieces that reference or connect to the tradition of African masking and masquerades. Nick Cave is an artist who is originally from Missouri and lives and works in Chicago and creates what are called sound suits. And so they range from fabric to just objects that he has found. He's a big thrift store patron. He collects objects and creates these elaborate, like, mask headdresses, like the one you can see over on the right side. And then he also creates these entire suits that people wear and can perform. They are also amazing to see move. And so I've put a link to a video in my little favorites folder if you want to see how these sound suits move. But it's very much exploring the idea of identity and and connection between the global community, and he's building off of, like I mentioned before, those African traditions. This last little section is going to focus on artists from Central and South America. And the work by these artists often addresses a history of colonialism and slavery and interaction among racial and ethnic groups. And the recognition that while some of the people living in these places are trying to leave, tourists from all over the world are also coming to some of these islands and beaches, and they are insulated from the harsh realities faced by most of the local people that are living there every day. So the art produced by the people of and from the Caribbean and Latin America tends to reflect these themes, the residue of colonialism, poverty, and political conflict, the northward push, and what life means from day to day. So the work that we are looking at right here is by a Cuban artist, Alexandre Arrechea, and it is a commentary on the irony about building and how in Havana, how they are building some new things and like buildings and things like that. There is a little bit of a continuation of the people who are doing the building, like the laborers. There is a lot of still struggle there. So in this particular photograph, you have an unknown, essentially anonymous person holding a stack of whitewashed bricks, and that obscures his identity. So the artist is using pictorial and symbolic devices like the hard fired clay bricks against the man's flesh, to kind of show the workers' struggle, and how there's somewhat of a kind of collective society that is all struggling to kind of build this nation. And in the textbook says the faceless man is locked into a task that seems to have no beginning or end. The image is one of quiet desperation. This is a work by a Haitian artist, Jean-Ulrich Desert, who has focused a lot of his projects on the relationship between immigrants and outsiders and some of their adopted or host countries. And cultural mixing and identity is what is being addressed here in this project called the Burqa Project. And so in this particular case, he has used national flags and he's turned them into burqas and draped them on mannequins. And so a burqa is a garment that Muslim women wear in some countries, whether they choose to wear it or are forced to wear it for the sake of modesty. So the flags used in this particular project represent Western countries of Germany, France, United States, and the United Kingdom. And it's supposed to suggest the tensions between religious and national identity that occur when Western and non-Western cultures clash. So this is something that has actually happened in France. There was legislation about forbidding people to be able to wear certain religious garb in public schools. And so this piece is drawing attention to that tension that exists. The work of Miguel Luciano, it focuses a lot on the cultural and economic relationship between the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico, where he was born, and the United States. So Puerto Rico is a self-governing commonwealth that was ceded to the United States in a treaty with Spain when the Spanish-American War ended at the end of the 19th century. So historically, the United States and Puerto Rico have had wavering feelings about their relationship. So US Congress at the end of that war was not unanimous in its support of annexation. And even today, Puerto Ricans continue to debate the island's political status, options between statehood, independence, or Commonwealth status quo. This particular photograph shows a Puerto Rican adolescent boy in just a white t-shirt and his culture-specific bling. So in Puerto Rico, sugar, tobacco, and plantains were once the island's cash crops. And so the boy is posing for the camera, kind of with his cocky expression, wearing this symbol of pride associated with his country's national identity. It also references American materialism and rap culture. So a lot of this photographer's work addresses political and economic and cultural subjugation. This is the work by Enrique Chagoya, and I'll show you a little detail of it here in just a moment so you can see the a little up close version of it. A lot of his works chronicle cultural change and exchange. He was born in Mexico City and has done a lot of work about immigration and that long-standing and unresolved issue between the United States and Mexico. He is an immigrant himself because he now works at Stanford University in California. So the detail of this work, which I'll show you right here, is a self-portrait of himself as a plucked chicken. So he's supposed to be like like a chicken that's had all the feathers torn out. And he's wearing a little sombrero, pedaling a bicycle as fast as he can while spouting critically correct phrases torn from the pages of literary or artistic theory. So he's the one particular one that says the detail I'm showing you, it's a little hard to read. It says, works to suggest that the act finally distills into something dense and unknowable. So a lot of the rest of the piece has some details that include visual references to pre-Columbian reliefs and wall paintings from the Mayan civilization. He writes that his artwork is a conceptual fusion of opposite cultural realities that I have experienced in my lifetime. I integrate diverse elements from pre Columbian mythology, Western religion, iconography, and American popular culture. And we'll conclude with the work of Amala Pica, who is an Argentinian artist. And a lot of her work tackles historical injustices. And this particular one is called Stage, as seen on Afghan Star. It's a recreation of a performance stage from the Afghani version of the reality competition TV show American Idol. So this was a televised program that happened in Afghanistan, and it was supposed to symbolize kind of a taste of democracy because Afghans could vote for their favorite singer, even though a lot of people in Afghanistan did not own TV sets because the Taliban had outlawed them in 1998. So um, this work is trying to engage with the concept of freedom of speech and democratic voting processes, also with the cult of celebrity and somewhat of the absurdity that people could vote for this seemingly kind of meaningless contest when really in reality maybe they should have had fair and free political elections. So this piece is talking about just the far-reaching influence of the global art market. The fact that this is an artist from Argentina, but she's making work about something that happened in Afghanistan. So it's really another reminder about kind of the borderlessness of a lot of artists' concerns and their desire to use their art to raise the consciousness of their international audiences. And so I just wanted to conclude with the fact that, when we talk about contemporary artists, sometimes it's challenging to pick artists that we can say, like, oh, these are people that are really changing the landscape of art and they've been really influential, because it's art that's happening right now. And it's hard to see exactly who's going to be making the lasting effects on art styles and things like that. Are there artists out there who are painting pretty landscapes and just doing nice, pretty artwork? Absolutely, and that's still happening as well. But I think that it was important that this last chapter really hit on some of the artists whose work is concerned with some deeper and more powerful topics, because when we think about the importance of visual art in our life today, like, how does it matter? Does it affect anything? I think that all of these artists were good examples of, yes, art does matter, and these artists are looking at the world and examining the issues and the problems that we are dealing with today, and they are going back and trying to draw attention to the history and the legacy of some of these issues, how we got where we are today, and recognizing the legacy of some of things such as slavery and colonialism, and how that is affecting our world today. And I think the fact that a lot of these artists are very international and making work about other places really shows that we can be connected to people that we've never met. We can be aware of issues that maybe don't necessarily directly affect us, but it's all in this effort to be aware, be conscious of how we've got to where we are today, and how we can be more educated and cognizant and compassionate to people around the world, and move forward to essentially create a better life for ourselves and for others. And I think that a lot of the artists that we've been looking at in this last chapter are really helping to shine a light on that. And that's going to conclude this chapter.